Gavin Haight was 4 and loved to give and get tickles. Jacqueline Salyers was a Puyallup tribal member, 32 years old. She was the mother of 4 children, pregnant with her 5th. Dylan Hockley liked plain spaghetti with garlic bread, and his favorite color was purple. Melissa Ramirez had a degree in business administration and had just received a promotion at her employer. Juan Velasquez was born in the Mexican state of Zacatecas, but became a U.S. citizen. He was 77. Michael Barrera was 30. He had 1 daughter and another on the way. Breonna Taylor worked as an ER medical technician. She liked muscle cars. John Leahy's passions included the blues, golf, and poker, and playing guitar and harmonica.
That was Professor Harvey Hix, who publishes under the name H.L. Hix, reading from his book American Outrage, a work of poetry that is also a compendium of extensive research about gun violence in the United States. It memorializes the lives lost, while also representing the various data, concepts, and ideas through which we attempt to make sense of the problem. In this episode of Humanities Conversations, you'll hear Hix speaking with Dr. Steve Dillon, director of UW's School of Culture, Gender, and Social Justice. The conversation reflects the breadth and depth of the book under discussion, covering Hicks's motivation for writing American Outrage, the book's unique structure, the challenges of comprehending gun violence, inequities in how human lives are valued and recorded, and much more that should be of interest to researchers, creative writers, and the general public. Throughout the episode, you'll hear references to other scholarly and literary publications. If something piques your interest, you can find the references listed in the show notes. The episode also has chapters enabled, so that you can easily navigate between different segments of the discussion. I now turn it over to Dr. Hix and Dr. Dillon for an insightful discussion about an urgent and pervasive problem.
Hi, everyone. My name is Steve Dillon. I'm the director of the School of Culture, Gender, and Social Justice here at the University of Wyoming. And I'll just say briefly, since he has it in front of him, I'm also the author of Fugitive Life, The Queer Politics of the Prison State. And in general, I'm a scholar of social movements and policing in prisons. And I'm here to talk with Harvey Hix, author of American Outrage, a Testamentary.
And hi, and I'm Harvey Hix, or I should probably introduce myself as H.L. Hix, since the book's published under the initials. Philosophy and Religious Studies program and the Creative Writing program, also here at University of Wyoming.
So Harvey, I thought before we dig into maybe specifics about the book, in particular, I have a lot of questions about the form of the book. I thought we could start more broadly about what inspired you to write this text, and also what inspired you to write it in the way you've written it?
It didn't start as a book. It started after a particular school shooting, when I just noticed that I had internalized without prior recognition of it. I had internalized a pattern that I find problematic in our broader society, in our ways of narrating public events, that the attention all went to the shooter. And so what I noticed was that I could tell you who the shooter was. I knew the shooter's name. Mm-hmm. I knew stuff about the personal history of the shooter, his family background, so on and so on. And so I knew all this stuff about the shooter, but I only knew the persons who had been shot as a group with a group identity. I didn't know any of the names of any of the people who had been shot or anything about any of them except for the fact that they were killed by someone in a mass shooting. And so it seemed like there's something wrong about that. There's something sort of fundamentally wrong about that. And so I just decided that on that occasion, this was one of a fairly quick sequence of school shootings and mass shootings. And I just decided, okay, in this one case, I'm going to see if I can actually find out what actually are the names of the people who were shot, and who actually were they, and who were they as living people, not as people who have been shot. And so that was the initial impulse, was I just want to try to push back a little bit in some token way against this broad public phenomenon that was also part of me. And so I just started looking up the individual people in that one event. And then what, of course, in retrospect is inevitable. Of course, that then led to, oh, wait a minute, school shootings aren't totally anomalous things. There's some kind of continuity with other things in our society. And so school shootings seem awfully connected to other mass shootings, or what are sometimes called rampage shootings. And those seem not unconnected to various hate crimes, like aggression against, killing of trans individuals, for example. And that connects to domestic violence issues and gender broadly, and state killings of citizens, and so on. And so if, to borrow the familiar cliche, I fell down a rabbit hole, and so that was the initial impulse. It wasn't initially an idea for a book. It was initially a mea culpa, and then it sort of became as maybe it had to. Yeah.
You kept referencing an event that led you down this rabbit hole, but you didn't actually name the specific event, and there's something almost telling about that. But do you remember what specific mass shooting it was, or shooting it was?
Yes, it was Sandy Hook.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. As a matter of how the research went, I did go event by event. So, first it was all the persons shot at Sandy Hook, and so on and so on. So Las Vegas and Orlando, et cetera, et cetera. But I also, as I was doing the research, I became more aware of the ways in which that also becomes a kind of shorthand for us. And so we now use, the fancy linguistic term for it is metonym. And so Sandy Hook now is a metonym like Vietnam is, or Washington. It's substituting a place name in order to refer to an event. And so what that led to was a conscious decision that even though every person who was killed in the Sandy Hook shooting is in the book, they're not together. What I wanted to do was to try to, even though I was researching all the members of that group, I wanted not to treat them because they were made members of the group by the shooter. So it's true of any number of mass shootings, and true also of other ways of grouping events. So there are any number of incidents of police killing civilians, but they're also not grouped together by contrast with incidents of domestic violence or whatever. The attempt was to try as much as I was able to see each person who was shot as a person, not defined by the event of their being shot.
I wonder if it'd be helpful to maybe like read just one page from the first section of the book.
Sure.
Just for our listeners. The book is organized in a very provocative way. The first half of it, each page has kind of three different modes of writing. The first maybe 2/3 of the page are a list of people's names with things they liked to do in life or things that were perhaps part of their humanity. The second part is a list of facts about gun violence. And then at the bottom of the page, I don't know what to call what happens here because different things happen here. And it's I have many questions about it. But sometimes there's very blunt political proclamations like "Make America Violent Again." Or sometimes there's incomplete sentences that seem to be you working through like an idea. But anyways, maybe we should look at a page and talk more about the details of it.
Patricio Arroyo was 13 years old and lived in Albuquerque. Jessica Klimchuk worked for a school in Ontario as an educational assistant, librarian, and bus driver. Maria Flores and Raul Flores first met in Juarez, Mexico. They had 3 children, 11 grandchildren, and 12 great-grandchildren. Hong Ying Jan liked to sing, play volleyball, dance, and play piano. She also liked to make food for friends and neighbors. Elio Cumana Rivas had applied for asylum in the U.S. He worked delivering food. Tara Welch Gallagher had worked as an engineer in her city's public works department for 6 years. Jeanette Anaya had managed an optical shop for 5 years. When it closed, she worked in various Santa Fe restaurants. Janisha Fonville lived with her girlfriend and her girlfriend's child. She had a mood disorder and a history of self-harm. Kareem Ali Nadir Jones was 30 and had 4 children. He loved music and sang in his church choir. Ernesto Canepa, a Mexican national, was 28 and a father of 4. 1 month. Length of time it takes for the number of American civilians who die from gunfire to exceed the number of deaths of U.S. military personnel in the first 10 years of the war in Afghanistan. Violence has a way of scattering narratives and people across time, space, and consciousness. It is possible that there is no other memory than the memory of wounds. Memory remembers.
Could you talk about how you came to this kind of structuring? Because I guess one thing that strikes me is 3 ways of reckoning with this violence.
Yeah.
1, through the kind of individual humanity that is also a collective humanity. 2, through a kind of a just preponderance of statistics about the violence we live with and often just accept. Yeah. And then these I don't know what to call the final section on the page, but sometimes they're theoretical insights. Sometimes they seem like you just releasing something.
Yeah.
Maybe you could talk about how you came to that structure.
Yeah, the structure did take a little time to sort out. So I was kind of well along in the research before I figured out what structure felt inevitable to me. And the structure developed out of the research. What what I began to see was that the research was sort of falling into lumps. So I was researching and finding people, human individuals. And I was also finding facts. And I was also being confronted with ideas. So I wanted all of those elements to be represented. And in a certain way, I wish if I were a better writer, maybe I'd have been able to integrate them in some smoother way. But they felt like they wanted each to have their own place. And so that was what led to sort of having the three, each page have all three identifiable components, each with its own sort of direction. And so they each, I hope that each of the three elements contributes something to the vision of the work. And so one of the things that became clear in the research, or what I understood as becoming clear to me from the research, was that violence, specifically gun violence, has at least these three qualities or characteristics. And one is that it's episodic. There are incidents of gun violence, lots of them in the U.S., but each incident has its own, there's a kind of wholeness to each incident. And so one person shoots another, and a certain group of people are affected by this. And so there's this episodic character. Each shooting is its own thing. And so I was hoping that got represented by the just naming and describing of the individuals. And that took the form that it had, that one of those three ingredients took its own form. I felt like I had to do something about the number of episodes. That portion of the book is 100 pages of each of those, and each page has 10 descriptions of names, or on rare occasion, as on the passage I just read, sometimes was as with Maria Flores and Raul Flores here. Every once in a while, there's a couple or a family that has a single entry. But essentially, it's 10 people per page. And so, 1,000 people. And that, of course, is a designed element. That became a design element in terms of the book. What I wanted that to do was to function the way that we sometimes use round numbers to function. And so, we might say in casual conversation, I might say something like, oh, Steve, don't remind me of that. That was 1,000 years ago. And I don't mean 999 plus 1 years. What I mean is a long time. Right. And so what I was hoping was that this very artificial decision to have 10 people per page and 100 pages, so 1,000 people represented, what I hoped was that could draw on that way of using round numbers to say, look, every one of these people was an individual human person. A whole life was ended. But also to say, look, I spent a lot of time learning about these 1,000 people, and And in the months since this book came out, more than 1,000 people have been killed by guns in the United States of America every month since then.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I wanted was for that first element to indicate, to sort of gesture towards the simple kind of inconceivable quantity.
And you do this in the epigraph to the book, and then you have a note in the middle of the book about the epigraph, but the epigraph to the book says, I didn't write every single name down. I wrote perhaps 1,000. The tragic list could go on. And then later you tell us where those epigraphs come from. Before I saw your explanation of the epigraphs, I was reminded of Toni Morrison's epigraph to Beloved, which is 60 million and more. And the whole book, you're just wondering both about the quantification, the 60 million, and the and more, that there's more, and we will never actually know what the more is, or who the more is, or how much the more was, or what the names of the more were. And we also don't know, in that particular case, we don't know the names of a lot of the 60 million.
Right.
Yeah. And I think you're doing, so I think, I'm just saying, I think of what you said in a different way, but about both naming what we can name and just confronting the impossibility of actually quantifying or even naming everyone and quantifying what the names actually mean. Right. Which I think the names you do name and the details you give about their lives does do that. But then there's just still so much more. Like this book could be 100,000 pages long, and I'm doing the thing with the number.
No, exactly.
Because it's just it's too much. Yeah. I'll just say this is from another wonderful book by I was noticing about you saying I wrote perhaps 1,000, that you don't even know how many you wrote. Right. And there's a wonderful book by this scholar named Sarah Haley, and the book is called No Mercy Here. And it's about African-American women in the convict lease system in Georgia in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And she's trying to recover the lives of these women who are essentially kidnapped and incarcerated and then built roads or constructed buildings, and she can only find references to who they were in the essentially the police records of their arrest. So she only knows them through their captors. Right. And she does this thing where it's a little like what Morrison does in Beloved, but she keeps saying perhaps when she was arrested, she tried to say goodbye to her children. Or perhaps when she was arrested, she held the hand of another convict. Right. Anyways, there's just something, the perhaps stuck out to me about actually almost like a summary of the rest of the project that you've done about knowing, like, I guess the balance between knowing and not knowing. Right. Yeah, it does seem as though an active imagination is called for that's not necessarily a possible act of imagination, or it's not an act of imagination that can ever be complete or robustly fulfilled, but it remains a necessary act of imagination, and that is to try to think oneself into a position other than one's own, and so it's maybe what you're pointing to is maybe the broader, more inclusive version of that initial fact that I was trying to respond to with the book, that our ways of recording, our ways of testifying to lives reflect and help to secure power structures and distribution of entitlements and so on. And so rich people and powerful people and entitled people get
more space and more words written about them. And then the people who are less entitled, and so that broad pattern can show up in very sort of particular, does show up in very particular ways, but what it means is that the project of writing the biography of a celebrity is in some important sense much, much, much easier than the project of writing the life of an African-American woman from a prior time period. Our term erasure, it's an apt metaphor. We just write more about already entitled people, and we erase the records of people with less entitlement. So the rich get more famous, and so the pattern seems to me to be really strong, and so it seems, I don't know this book that you just mentioned, but the project seems sort of by definition a powerful one to recuperate, to find the evidences that do remain of this life that was a human life, just as human, less entitled than you and me, but just as human. And so that project seems a valiant one, and it seems in this historical moment when, we're in a moment when, in economic terms, distributive justice in our particular historical moment, we're at a moment of exaggeration of wealth gap, for instance. So the amount of wealth that is controlled by a tiny, tiny number of people, exceeds the wealth. I think the last figure that I saw that was a few years ago was that the richest three individuals, three people, the same number of people that are in this room right now, the richest three people in the United States have as much wealth as the lowest 60% of citizens in the U.S.
I was going to say there's something, I think you do say it explicitly, but it's also implicit in the book, is like the question of value and how a life comes to have value and who gets to be valuable.
Right.
And I think you do it around, again, in the middle of the book, there's kind of this like pedagogical, I don't think it's didactic, but you do kind of instruct or let the reader know what you're doing in the first half of the book. And one of those things is around the question of innocence and guilt. And you're not interested in like someone's life is less valuable because they were guilty or because they were innocent. You're just interested in, or because they were rich or poor or whatever they were, or how they died even.
Right.
It makes me think of this, Ruth Wilson Gilmore is a scholar of incarceration and a activist. And I saw her speak a few years ago, and she said, we need a movement to defend the guilty. And I think that's something actually Black Lives Matter did that was really brilliant, was to actually just say it's always wrong. It doesn't matter like if you did it or didn't do it.
Right.
Or if you were on drugs or weren't on drugs or were crazy or not crazy or whatever it is.
Right.
Anyways, you refuse that gesture throughout the book of saying, besides age, which sometimes is equated with innocence, we don't know, like some of these people may have died because they were shooting at police or because they were shooting at someone else, or we actually don't know. Right. Anyways, there's the structure of value you're outlining in the United States obviously seems then connected to how we grieve people and remember people and who gets narrated and how much they get narrated.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And it does seem that recognition seems to be difficult to achieve and sustain, the recognition that you've just articulated, that the fact that there are episodes does not mean that episodes are only episodic. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean that they're isolated as episodes. And so there is also, in addition to the episodic, there is the structural or systemic. And so it means that it makes it an active imagination. Or I think, as you articulated in your book, there's an epistemology at work in being able to hold in mind both things, that human persons are equal in worth, however we want to name it, intrinsic worth, standing before the law, standing before justice, and that there are systemic forces at work that alter the conditions in which people live, mm-hmm. that shape the possibilities that are available to people, that influence people's bodies and minds and patterns of thinking and so on. And so that notions like notions of guilt and innocence are very complicated by that. Mm-hmm. Is it this? Is it the same thing if a person who holds a very entitled position in society, came from a safe, secure household, had physical, personal safety in childhood and youth, has comfortable economic circumstances, et cetera, mm-hmm. engages in a seemingly analogous event as a person who was in an abusive household as a child, mm-hmm. has never had economic security, et cetera, engages in, making scare quotes in the air, the same event. Is it the same thing? Is guilt the same? So it seems like mm-hmm. seems like the combination of episodic and systemic or structural is very difficult to maintain. And as I observe people making evaluations, it seems to me that the easier one to erase or simply not to understand is the systemic or the structural. Yeah. And so it's hard not to have a recognition of episodes. It's hard not to see that episodes mm-hmm. happen. It's very easy. It appears to me as though it's very easy to go through a whole life with no recognition of structural forces at work, mm-hmm. and no recognition that those things shape our lives and influence who we are and what we do and so on. And certainly not to acknowledge the impact of that. So it seems like a very, very difficult thing to do. And of course, it's part of I don't claim any achievement of that, but it's part of the ambition of the book and having this juxtaposition of the parts, to have the episodic as manifest by the names of persons killed, followed by this data that just acknowledges things, can show up in things such as gun violence as a public health phenomenon. Mm-hmm. So one of the interesting things to be shown that I felt like I was shown by the research is, look, we cut down on the number of traffic fatalities when, decades ago, there came to be a recognition, enough of a widespread recognition that people dying in car wrecks is not only episodic. It's not only this person was in a car wreck and died and this person was in a car wreck and died. We have a systemic problem here.
Right, it's structural.
We have a public health issue. The public health issue is lots of Americans die every year in car wrecks. Can we do something about it? And so people came up with the idea of seatbelts and airbags and whatever all else we now do by way of safety, making cars safer and so on and so on. Experimenting with other kinds of things, regulations of speed limits, et cetera, but construing it as a public issue because we recognize that it's also systemic. And it seems as though we haven't hit that moment yet in relation to gun violence where we're able collectively and with some kind of something resembling consensus to acknowledge gun violence as also not only episodic, but also as a public health issue. It's maybe has everything to do with rights and so on. Maybe has everything to do with individuals and who we are as individuals, but also has to do with us as a group. And lots of us die every year. It's also a structural thing. You can learn stuff about it from statistics. And so that was sort of what that second element wanted to acknowledge about gun violence is, yes, it's lots of episodes, but it's also it's a structural, systemic concern, matter of concern. It affects all of us. And I would want to think we would do well to think of it also in those terms. Yeah.
There's a trans legal theorist and activist named Dean Spade who says the main thing social movements do for us is redefine what violence is and help us see violence that is just utterly banal. And the example I often give my students is in the first Trump administration, they deregulated air pollution laws. And the Trump administration's own calculation of how many people it would kill was 10,000 Americans. Right. 8 years later, the medical journal, The Lancet, actually looked at the data and said it killed 17,000 people. I mean, just a scale of misery and death that is, along the lines of your book, like impossible to actually comprehend. Right.
But anyways, that's part of the. Yeah. It seems to me that's part of the active imagination that's called for. That I mean, again, to appeal to your book and the reconceiving of the prison system, understanding it in different terms, recognizing it as you introduce early on, drawing on others' research, but in introducing this conceiving of it as not only about reformation, but about immobilizing. Okay, if I understand it in different terms, then I see something else about it that I hadn't seen before, and it does seem like that act of reconceiving is always. I mean, it's something that I feel like I didn't get to with American Outrage. Was the finding that way to characterize a reconception. I hope that American Outrage invites a reconception. I perceive the process of researching and writing it as having provoked reconception for me. But what I don't feel like that it reached was this point of sort of coalescing all of that into a like a term or something that sort of here's the name of the way we thought about gun violence before, and here's the new name for the new way to think about it.
But I think what the book does, and maybe I'll disagree with you about your own book, but that it doesn't tell us, it actually shows us. Like in the organization of the page, you're actually confronted with, you have to confront the violence in a number of modalities. And I can't remember, I don't know the exact studies off my head, but there's a lot of studies that say statistics don't change people's minds. Right. So but you still need them, but you need more than them. And there's something like each page, like you're confronted with the statistics and the more than the statistics. And I think instead of like telling people through a keyword or a new definition, like you're actually, it's like a process, and you actually have to go through it. Maybe like grief, like you have to go through it.
Right.
And it's difficult.
Yeah. And that I hope the book does achieve, that it, I don't have a solution to gun violence, and I mean, you'll know what I mean when I say this. I don't want to have a solution. It's not my place to tell you or anybody else what the solution is. But I don't think that leaves any of us in a vacuum. That the decision not to always go around bossing one another about and instructing one another in what's right and wrong, I don't think that puts us in a place of some kind of like thoroughgoing relativity. You hold your view on gun violence and I'll hold my view. I'm okay, you're okay. I don't think it leaves us in that position.
I feel like the book opens the door, and the door's open for everyone to walk through it and figure something out.
That's the hope.
Although I will say you do have in the bottom of the page where you have these kind of sometimes proclamations, but you do actually have one solution, which you say, I think we could regulate guns like cars, which is like actually a very practical. And I can't remember the Republican, but there was a Republican congressperson who he accidentally said that out loud, and then he realized what he had said and the implications of what he had said.
Right.
That there is actually a solution. You could license them. You could obviously you could regulate them much more thoroughly. You could require training. Like there's a lot of stuff we could do. And cars, as you were talking about earlier, like are an example. Like is actually quite practical. Yeah. Even as there's something much, much deeper at work that's going to require something bigger of just but that requires that gesture of like, okay, I open the door. Like everyone needs to now step through it.
Right.
And I don't have the answer.
Yeah. I hope that it makes that kind of thing available to us all. Doing this research and trying to organize the research and present the results of the research changed me, changed my understanding. And I hope it would create that possibility for anybody, no matter what the starting position was, whatever your particular senses of possible resolutions and whatever your sense of it as a problem, that somebody who's coming in, I'm a NRA member who owns lots and lots of guns and I like to shoot them, to, the person who's never touched a gun, opposes all forms of gun ownership and so on. Whoever you are coming in, my hope is that it makes something available, that it doesn't try to tell you what you're right about and what you're wrong about, like I would be able to do that, but just says, look, have spent some time trying to find the best information I can, trying to put some stuff together, and it's there available to us all. We can all it's not a forfeiture for any of us of our subject positions and our, life commitments and so on, to be able to, again, an act of imagination, to imagine ourselves as, Adam Smith's impartial spectator, the person who's able to hypothetically or as if, to draw back from a situation and, again, with scare quotes, objectively look at the situation. That, it's not, I'm not forfeiting by engaging in that act of imagination. I'm not forfeiting my position. I might be opening myself up to altering my position some, or just understanding somebody else's position a little bit better. And so, maybe there's some value in, we all recognize how polarized U.S. society is, again, at this sort of moment in our political and economic history. We recognize this is a moment of kind of extreme polarization. But we all recognize that that's the case. And maybe there's some value for all of us, whichever pole of that polarizing we occupy and are committed to. There might be some value in trying at least to understand the other person's side, and it might be very particular to our time. The intensity of the problem might be particular to our time. I'm just, as we're speaking, it calls to mind a book that I read, I don't know, a year or two ago, about social media. And the authors claim the book is by Jaron Lanier, and it has a kind of longish title. I forget the exact title, but it's basically 10 reasons why you should quit your social media right now. The title is something like that.
Yeah.
But one of the points that he makes is that we actually receive information differently than we did pre-social media,
right?
And pre-Google and pre-internet. So if you're very blue and I'm very red, we were in 1965. Both of us were watching Walter Cronkite,
right,
and so I knew what was in your head that you were so badly misinterpreting. And you knew what was in my head that I'm so badly misinterpreting.
Right.
And so even though we disagreed with one another radically, we were disagreeing about the same thing.
Yeah.
And that with algorithms now, your phone or computer doesn't give you, even from the same site, much less the sites that you're looking at versus the sites I'm looking at. Your computer or phone doesn't feed you the same stuff that mine feeds me. And so it's not just that I think you have wrong ideas and you think I have wrong ideas. I don't even know what you're wrong about.
And I think you mentioned earlier, like, a kind of willingness to be transformed, and also that you were transformed in the book. And I think the kind of algorithmic governance of ourselves also ossifies us. Like you're only reinforced in the position you're in.
Absolutely.
You're not actually invited to transform yourself and to change.
Absolutely.
So you can't even encounter someone else and think. You don't ever actually encounter the other.
Exactly.
You only encounter a reinforcement of what you already are.
Our tendency for confirmation bias just gets confirmed.
Right.
So, yeah.
Do you want to read another passage, or?
Sure.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, actually.
No, I think another passage would be good.
Okay.
Would you read one?
Oh, yeah. I actually have one. I think I disagree with, because I wonder what you're doing with poetry in the book. So this is a passage that's in the middle of the book that I said a little earlier is kind of like a pedagogical explanation to the reader about what the first half is doing. And so this brief paragraph is kind of you reflecting on your use of evidence. And you write this. In the sciences and social sciences, prevailing standards for presenting results include explicitly identifying limitations of the research being reported. Here is one limitation of the research presented in American Outrage. In some ways, it reproduces and reinforces precisely what it would resist. It would contest the underreporting of certain types of violence, for example, domestic violence, but it relies methodologically on existing reports. It would shift the emphasis in testimony away from familiarizing, quote, he had a heart of gold, and toward particularizing, quote, she taught history at the same high school she had attended. But it can only give particulars already given by others. Though American Outrage has not sought to be limited in these ways, it cannot suffer such limitations. It cannot but suffer such limitations.
Yeah.
I'm really struggling with this paragraph. Like in some ways I agree and I see your argument that you're trying to exceed what the evidence can do, but you need the evidence to do what you're trying to do. So you are necessarily perhaps failing. But then I wonder if what you're doing in the first half of the book with form is actually a response to the problem of evidence. And it made me think of this book by Ben Lerner called The Hatred of Poetry. Have you read it? But his argument is that no poem can do what poetry aspires to do. Poetry aspires to this kind of transcendent, spiritual or utopic possibility, and every single poem fails at that possibility. Yeah. But I think there's something in his argument and also what you're doing with form in the first half that responds to this problem of evidence that and I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah.
And maybe that's to go back to the beginning just about how you came to like this could have been a sociological scholarly paper in a journal.
Right.
And some of it, like the second half is just your sources.
Yeah.
And there are like very brief glimmers that read like maybe a more traditional scholarly research paper, but you're also not doing that at all. Yeah. So you're like using the evidence, but doing something different with it.
Yeah. That did feel, it did feel compelled to me. I did feel as though I, had to do that. I don't think it's only my incompetence at traditional scholarship. I don't think it's only that. It did feel like it was compelled by this situation that you're describing. That yes, I'm trying to recognize and record precisely what doesn't get recognized and recorded in our customary way. So in that way, very much your analogy of the book. What was the author's name again?
Ben Lerner.
The book on African American.
Oh, Sarah Haley.
Sarah Haley, right. So the Sarah Haley book, the situation seems to me very closely analogous to that of from your description, what I hear as her project is I want to write into the record what got written out of the record, what didn't get written. I want to write that into the record. And so there's an inherent impossibility in the project and an inherent kind of impediment that is also, as per Ben Lerner, a difference between the orienting ideal and the possibility of fulfillment of the ideal or degree of fulfillment of the ideal.
And then also just along the lines of what we were talking about, like also what a discipline can do and can't do. Like Beloved is not a piece of historiography. It would never, ever be published in a historical journal. It could not pass peer review. Sarah Haley, I know, or people doing C.D. Hartman has also done similar work. Like there's a boundary where you're no longer doing scholarship,
right?
And you would be like disciplined out of the discipline,
right?
And same with what you're doing with evidence. Like, this couldn't be published in a scholarly journal or a more traditional sociological journal, for example.
Right.
So, anyways, there's something that's just to say, like you're doing something with evidence that, some disciplines cannot do. Like they would actually be trapped. But I think because you then go to poetry, something else happens, which I think is Lerner's point about poetry as a form versus particular poems.
Yeah, because I do believe in the possibilities of form. It's how we communicate with it. We create forms. We're engaged in a form right now, a social form of dialogue, very sort of, and a formalized version of that. And so we're all the time creating these forms. And of course we do it, in all our ways of, researching and studying and thinking and conceiving, whether that's in the kinds of things that we think of as scholarship in the humanities and social sciences. So things where the product is a paper, or, an academic scholarly book. That's a form, and it has certain formal expectations, really certain formal enforced requirements of the form.
Yeah.
And the form creates certain possibilities. And so, it's hard to think of any other mode in our society in which we more robustly engage in consecutive, sequenced thought, following a train of thought through a body of evidence, from premises explicitly stated to conclusion argued for. Hard to think of a form, more than this scholarly book that fulfills that better, more robustly. But it's also not the only way in which we assimilate information, and not only assimilate, try to take into ourselves, but also confront, try to respond meaningfully and in a healthy way to information, bodies of information, bodies of life experience, shared experience, private experience, individual experience, collective experience. How to deal with that? We deal with that in scholarly articles and books. We deal with that in Ben Lerner poems. We deal with that in churches. In people, many people in our society, one way of processing life experience is to gather with other people on a regular, recurring basis and sing songs together. So we engage in ritual. There are all kinds of ways in which we try to accept and deal with and confront and live fully our individual and shared life experiences. And yeah, so for me, poetry is one of them. And for me, this attempt to not only scan information, but to organize it according to some form or pattern seems to me to be valuable. So there was a moment in one of my classes this week where I was having the students in the class work in small groups, and one of the requirements was that each small group had to write 2 sentences on the board. Mm-hmm. And part of the rationale that I gave for this seemingly capricious requirement is a thought is complete in a different way after you've written it on the page or the whiteboard mm-hmm. than it is when it's in your head. And so for me, one way of trying to confront and assimilate a vast body of for one thing, information, but also life experience. One of the little data points in the book was the percentage of people in the United States who know someone who has been killed by a gun. Mm-hmm. And it's an extraordinary percentage of people in the U.S. And so that the assimilation of this vast body of information and life experience and so on. And one way for me to try to do that is to find some form of organization. It's a fancy version of the grocery list, right? I got to remember that I need yogurt and whatever, a box of cold cereal this week. And so how am I going to remember it? Well, on a piece of scrap paper or on my phone or on my whatever, somehow or other, I'm going to make a list, and I'm probably going to make the list according to where things are in the grocery store. Mm-hmm. And so it's a bunch of information that, I had it in my head before I made the list, but now I have it in a different way. Mm-hmm. If I've written it down on a piece of paper in the order in which I will encounter it in the grocery store, it's there in a different way, and it's functional in a different way. Mm-hmm. And so that's the hope behind this, maybe initially bizarre, I hope not off-putting, but maybe initially strange. Like the first part of this book looks funny on the page. It doesn't look like just, I'm just going to open a novel and there are going to be blocks of prose in paragraphs with its start and so on. It looks different from that. And so it might look a little funny, but the attempt is to find an organization that, like the grocery list, helps me assimilate and use this information.
You said you were changed and transformed by writing the book, but I wonder about how it felt more emotionally and how you reckoned with it. And I'll tell you the story that I've been researching solitary confinement for like 15 years. And a few years ago, I was sharing some of this research in a public talk. And during the Q&A, this person raised his hand and he was like, "I'm a professor of chemistry and I work with dangerous chemicals. And when I'm in my lab, I wear protective gear. What's your protective gear?" And I was just kind of like totally dumbfounded, both because I had never thought of it that way and because he was kind of seeing me in a way I wasn't totally aware that people might see doing this kind of research where you're just, it sounds like you spent 10 years just sitting with violence. Yeah. And you said it transformed you, but I wonder about how you, I don't know the word even, handled it or reckoned with it or treated yourself or comforted yourself or. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. On the one hand, I think that it is one of the forms of my entitlement in society. Relatively speaking, by comparison with many other people, I'm relatively safe from gun violence.
Mm-hmm.
I go to bed early. I'm not out late at night.
Right.
I own a home. Have secure
Mm-hmm.
physical surroundings. Relatively speaking, have a safe space in
Mm-hmm.
society, and so I'm not writing this from already a position of vulnerability,
Mm-hmm.
having directly experienced gun violence myself.
Mm-hmm.
So I do know persons who were killed by gun violence, but it's not like I've never been shot.
Mm-hmm.
I've never been direct witness of a shooting and so on. So there's a kind of safety from my good fortune of my place in society that is protective gear.
Mm-hmm.
And so
structure.
Yeah. So that's one thing, but I hope that it's one of the forms of transformation, because there is an inconceivability in this part. Part of what the data does for one, the data moves in the direction of numbing.
Mm-hmm.
I can give you the numbers,
Right.
for how many people, but I can't actually conceive of how many people it is who die from gun
Mm-hmm.
violence in the United States. And so there's something that's numbing about that, but that I think it's one of the ambitions of the book is to try to make oneself a little bit less numb, to invite. I use the word in a way that you'll know how to qualify, to invite a certain level of suffering.
Mm-hmm.
In the way that we do in watching a film, a historical drama.
Or I'm just thinking of like in like Buddhist philosophy, there's the notion of like the only way out is through. Like you actually have to, you have to go through it.
Yeah. And so I want to make sure and be clear about the disclaimer. I did a bunch of research. That's not the same thing as experiencing gun violence in the way that someone who has been shot or who, a loved one was killed by gun violence or was witness to a mass shooting or something like that. This is not, I'm not claiming any form of analogy with that kind of experience. But one thing I hope that this makes possible, what I believe that it made possible for me in some way, and what I hope it makes possible for the reader in some way, is the kind of qualified, the cathartic kind of, scare quotes in the air, suffering that is possible by, what Aristotle talks about with Greek tragedy and the way one might talk about reading an intense novel or watching an intense film. That sense of identifying with a person whose experience is traumatic. I'm not so comfortable with the word empathy, but it gestures in that direction. Some form of willing oneself toward rather than away from others' experience that is not experience one desires. So it's one thing to have the kind of fantasy, the fascination that we have with the rich and famous, reality shows about, people on desert islands and TV shows about celebrity mansions and so on, that kind of fantasy of, I wish I was rich. Mm-hmm. The sort of the inverse of that. Wait a minute. There's also a way to, without having the delusion that you are somehow doing it, there's also a way to face toward rather than facing away from persons whose experiences are harsher than one's own. Mm-hmm. Persons whose circumstances are less desirable than one's own. And I hope that in the case of gun violence, I hope that the book is not just didactic in the sense of, shooting people is bad, don't shoot people. I hope that it's offering something else that's more in this vein of looking at rather than looking away, feeling toward rather than feeling away from, or being numbed toward. I hope that it works in that direction. I'm not deluded into believing that it somehow fully achieves this, but I hope that that's the direction it is inclined towards. Gavin Haight was 4 and loved to give and get tickles. Jacqueline Salyers was a Puyallup tribal member, 32 years old. She was the mother of 4 children, pregnant with her 5th. Dylan Hockley liked plain spaghetti with garlic bread, and his favorite color was purple. Melissa Ramirez had a degree in business administration and had just received a promotion at her employer. Juan Velasquez was born in the Mexican state of Zacatecas, but became a U.S. citizen. He was 77. Michael Barrera was 30. He had 1 daughter and another on the way. Breonna Taylor worked as an ER medical technician. She liked muscle cars. John Leahy's passions included the blues, golf, and poker, and playing guitar and harmonica. Tausha Haight was active in her church and enjoyed spending time with her 5 children. Mulasio Booker was a 23-year-old trans woman from South Dallas. 8. Number of rounds fired by an Arvada, Colorado police officer at unarmed, 5-foot-tall, 7 months pregnant Destiny Thompson. 8. Of the 10 bullets from a Border Patrol agent's gun that hit Jose Antonio Elena Rodriguez, the number that hit him in the back. 9. Of the 16 shots fired by a police officer at Laquan McDonald, the number that hit his back. No duty to retreat changes violence from last resort to point of pride. Stand your ground kills more adults and kills more kids. Tell me again what makes it yours, the ground you're standing your ground on.